Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Roger Green. I'm the general editor of the New Polis. Today we have a conversation titled The Politics of Pause, and our discussants are Benjamin Noyce, who's a professor of critical theory and coordinator of the MA English Literature program at the University of Chichester. His research focuses on critical theory and literary theory, with particular interest in the avant-garde, film, and cultural politics of theory. His recent work includes The Persistence of the Negative and Malign Velocities. And then Sarah Pessin is a professor of philosophy and Jewish thought at the University of Denver. She works broadly in the areas of phenomenology and philosophy of religion, with areas of focus in late ancient and medieval Neoplatonisms and modern Jewish thought, with the emphasis on Levinas. She's the author of Abin Gabriel's Theology of Desire, and is currently finishing up I think it's actually three books now on Levinas, pausality, pastness, and politics in Levinas. You can correct me if I'm wrong there, but from our recent discussions, you're producing a lot. So welcome everybody. This is like a really robust group of people. So thank you, people I haven't seen here before. Robert Urquhart, thank you for being here. Tinker. So some usuals and some new folks as well. I'll let the discussants each present their talk, and then we can let them interact with each other as they like, and then we'll just shift to Q&A, just general Q&A, and feel free to chime in. Just remember to keep your mic off if you're not talking, so that we don't get ambient noise. Had you guys, either of you decided who would like to start? Okay, Benjamin's going to start us off.
Yeah, so thank you, Roger, and thank you to everyone who's turned up and joined the conversation. And thank you to Sarah for the original invitation. She suggested that my work might kind of resonate with what she's doing, and I think it's a kind of experiment. I'm sure it will, but we're going to try and find out what will happen. So my talk goes first, really just because I'm kind of trying to set the scene around some of the debates. So I've written some kind of notes and reflections on accelerationism, which I'll explain in a moment. So I'm kind of doing the scene setting. So that's why I'll just explain. So I guess I should start with the idea that, which I think is fairly common, that we're used to thinking that we live in a time that is accelerating. There's the runaway processes of man-made climate change, the penetration of digital technology, I'm laughing because I'm on it, into our lives. We live the present as a speeding up. At least that's how it often feels. There is debate about that. We could also add that politics itself is often presented in the mode of speed or acceleration or urgency. We must do something now. Becomes a kind of political demand. And in response, of course, we've also seen various movements or claims to slow down. So we've seen slow food movement in Italy, recent arguments in academia for the slow professor, and more generally calls to bring these kind of various processes of speed under control. Finally, just because we're all here in this forum because of this, we could add that the global pandemic of 2020 has led us all to experience something of an enforced slowing down. Although we could also add, depending on what your experience has been like, of online work or hybrid teaching. I'm doing hybrid teaching. This slowing down might have been not an unequivocal experience. So it's kind of interesting, our own temporality at this moment. Now, having said all that, what I've been interested in critically are the people who say, what about speeding up more? Rather than either kind of slowing down or kind of staying where we're at, what about we need to accelerate the process? And this is what I've called accelerationism, a term I think I first coined about 2008 on a blog. If you remember blogs, those ancient things. And since then, it formed part of my book, Persistence of the Negative, and then got kind of turned around into something that people adopted as a positive. So I've always used accelerationism as a critical term. But in an interesting kind of twist of fate, it's being used as a positive. So just to briefly define, I guess, what contemporary accelerationists would say they are or what they do, we could argue that contemporary accelerationism is a claim to embrace technology and other forms of social abstraction to try and produce or develop a new post-capitalist future. So that's the kind of definition. In fact, as was briefly talked about before we kind of come online, there are various other definitions of accelerationism floating around the world. And so that may come into our discussion later. But I think people who call themselves accelerationists are keen to say that what they mean by that is the embrace or use of technology, particularly, and other forms of abstraction to develop a post-capitalist future. Now, what I want to pick out about that is particularly this claim to the future. One of the key works by accelerationist thinkers is called Inventing the Future. And you'll find in accelerationist works and writings a relentless emphasis on the need to imagine, construct, produce, or invent the future. And the argument by accelerationists runs that if we can't do that, then our politics will be retro, will be limited, will be a kind of folk politics. They adopt this idea of folk politics from neurophilosophy, where folk psychology are the kind of intuitive beliefs we have about ourselves and our place in the world and our sense of self.
On like a lecture by Sarah Pessin. Who was that girl? She was the woman.
That are not true. You know, we have self-perceptions, but our biology is different. So they call this folk politics.
No, it's through Carl's.
Claire Mulk, your microphone is on.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, let me carry on. So what I want to suggest is that accelerationism is this thing, and I'm trying to counter it. But what I want to suggest first is that the battle over the future that they're proposing and that's being waged is in fact a battle over the past. I also want to suggest that this battle over the past in the name of the future suggests that we've lost faith in the present. And finally, I want to briefly consider two critical figures that I've used that might help us to come to grips with accelerationism. The first is the new idea of the emergency brake proposed by Walter Benjamin. And the second is the reworking of the figure of the catacomb, which I'll explain and come back to later in the paper. But I think as a way of thinking about the present between the past and a utopian or apocalyptic future. So first things first, accelerationism, as I say, appears as a defiantly futurist politics, not only in its concern with technology, but also in its claim to have a monopoly on the future. And yet I would suggest that accelerationism is a form of nostalgia. More precisely, I call it capitalist ostalgie. So ostalgie is a term used in Germany for those who are obsessed with the old communist regimes, particularly East Germany. So it's kind of Eastalgia, nostalgia for East Germany. It includes kind of actual kind of nostalgia or kind of ironic things like tours, city tours in the Trabant, the notoriously bad East German car, very anti-accelerationist East German car. So ostalgie gets used to refer to this kind of longing for the old communist regime. What I say about accelerationism is that it is a capitalist ostalgie. It is a nostalgia for moments of capitalist acceleration, moments of past social achievement and cultural innovation. So this ranges from the kind of a nostalgia for the dynamism of capitalist development, what Marx says that's all that solid melts into air, and for the post-war les Trente Glorieuses, the seeming kind of 30 years or more of kind of capitalist production development. And within accelerationism and accelerationist thinkers, These moments of nostalgia for the past are quite specific. They range from the Cold War space programs to experiments in cybernetics in Allende's Chile and in the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s. The cultural advances of electronic dance music in the UK. We can actually have an entire debate about accelerationism solely through the medium of electronic music, which I'm quite happy to do, because I think that's quite interesting. Cyberpunk science fiction, post-punk music, and 70s experimental television. So they're looking to the past for images of the future. And this is a nostalgia not just for capitalism so much, but for kind of social democratic capitalism, and particularly the cultural innovations of the 1970s before the emergence of what we tend to call neoliberalism. We have a whole discussion about when that starts. The dream of the accelerationist is the dream of productive forces unleashed to global ends. Now, before I go on, one thing that's interesting is all these past moments are not, I would say, simply moments of acceleration. They're all actually quite complex themselves temporally. Post-punk, for example, just to mention post-punk music, is not all music that comes after punk. There's post-punk before punk. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. But what we have here is a loop back to the past to jump ahead to the future. And obviously you might be familiar with this image of the loop from science fiction. There is a film, not very good film in my opinion, called Looper. And you're all familiar with time travel paradoxes that emerge. Back to the Future, The Terminator would be the great film for accelerationists. This kind of movement back, in this case, to the future, literally. So contemporary accelerationists, therefore, are kind of making a move backwards to jump ahead. So what I'm suggesting here is that accelerationism is not so much an argument about the future, but an argument about the past that presents itself as an argument about the future, and that in doing so, what goes missing is the present. So I think that's one of its problems. So now I want to talk about these two moments or critical concepts or critical interruptions that I have briefly really kind of suggested at a couple of points. And when Sarah asked me, I realized that I haven't really gone back to them or kind of fleshed them out for kind of reasons. So I think you'll see that I have kind of problems with my own critical concepts, but I think they're worth mentioning because they're kind of interesting ways to frame discussion. The first figure I want to consider regarding a kind of anti-accelerationism is Walter Benjamin's use of the concept of the emergency brake. And this occurs in his notes to the 1940 essay on the concept of history, or sometimes known as Theses on the Philosophy of History. This is what he says. Marx says that revolutions are the locomotive of world history, but perhaps it is quite otherwise. Perhaps revolutions are an attempt by the passengers on the train, namely the human race, to activate the emergency brake. Now, there's a lot that you can say about this passage, and in fact, one of the chapters in my book, a short book, is on that, and I've written another essay on it because I'm also quite interested in trains. It's one of the things I like. But I want to just pick out a few things. The first, as we were sort of briefly discussing beforehand, is that Benjamin himself is, we could argue, criticizing his own earlier accelerationism, or at least qualifying his own earlier accelerationism. So if you are familiar with Walter Benjamin, you should obviously know the work of art essay, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction or technological reproducibility. And that essay famously engages with capitalist technology, film, as a potential revolutionary moment. And as you'll also know, this is inspired by Benjamin's friendship with Brecht, and Brecht's own kind of emphasis on production and productivism, which has been well brought out by Frederick Jameson, who has kind of in many ways updated these sorts of arguments. So Benjamin in the in the theses and in these kind of comments is not only responding to German social democracy, which he also is, and its failures to confront fascism. He is responding, if you like, to his own past and his own kind of thinking. The other thing to say about the emergency break is that Benjamin also thinks about it in terms of interruption. Classless society, Benjamin notes, is not the final goal of historical progress, but its finally achieved interruption. So as you'll know, the theses on the philosophy of history are a questioning of the notion of historical progress. And what Benjamin suggests in his notes is that, in fact, the classless society may be the interruption of historical progress rather than its fulfillment. So this, it seems to me, suggests that the emergency break is not just a way of avoiding disaster, not simply a coming to a halt, but a stopping or interruption that is both the goal and another way off the train. And certainly it's interesting that since Marx and Benjamin and in the 21st century, as I still kind of have to remind myself we're in, we've seen a recurrence or interest in the metaphor of the train as a metaphor for revolution and the break or interruption. So I'm thinking here of China Miéville's Iron Council or Bong Joon-ho's Snowpiercer would be another example. So while the emergency break is often presented as self-evident, just stop the train, I think we have to think here about a politics of interruption that obviously Benjamin's death brought short. Still on schedule. Good. My other figure that I want to briefly talk about is to think about the notion of the pause that Sarah proposed, is the catechon. And this is a biblical figure ascribed to Paul. It occurs in Thessalonians 2:6-7. I'm not a biblical scholar, just warning here. But there is a debate about whether Paul wrote Thessalonians. I think it's widely agreed that he did not. But this is what is said. And you know what is now restraining him, so that he may be revealed when his time comes. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, but only until the one who now restrains it is removed. So what's kind of weird here, the catechon I think only really occurs in this passage. The catechon is the one who restrains the coming of the Antichrist. And it also restrains the eschatological enthusiasm of early Christian communities, who so often thought or acted as if the moment of redemption had already arrived. If you've read Paul's letters, they're quite funny because they're basically a series of moans, like stop acting as if the Messiah has come, stop it. You know, you can still sin, you know, you have to kind of behave yourselves. This is a kind of series of ill-tempered injunctions to various groups of Christians, often to realize it hasn't arrived yet. So the catechon then is a figure of stability in the last days. It's a highly ambiguous figure because it prevents disaster, it's preventing the coming of the Antichrist, but of course the coming of the Antichrist is the condition of the coming of the Messiah, so it's delaying the messianic arrival as well. The catechon's not named in the passage, but it's assumed that the early Christians know who it is, and you know what is now restraining him. And so it's been commonly identified with the Roman Empire. We don't actually know. Also, of course, the catechon has been deployed in contemporary political debates by the reactionary legal theorist Carl Schmitt. And Schmitt identifies the catechon with the state. Here, as in Hobbes, who obviously influences Schmitt on this point, the catechon plays the role of that which restrains disorder and chaos, especially civil war. So the state becomes the figure of the catechon. And of course, for Schmitt, particularly in his post-war work, this allows him to kind of justify, and I put that in heavily inverted commas, his choice, and even more heavily inverted commas, of Nazism. Because Schmitt's excuse, his self-exculpation for his embrace of Nazism, is kind of better the state than chaos. So better the Nazis than the Weimar Republic, in short. This, of course, severely understates Schmitt's enthusiasm for Nazism. and his own anti-Semitism and everything else, really. But the catechon is also for Schmitt an important principle of history, because it explains the necessity of the Christian continuation of the Roman Empire. It explains, this is the problem of Christianity. If the Messiah doesn't turn up again, what do you do in the meantime? And so for Schmitt, this kind of continuity of the Christian kind of faith is important for him for explaining a kind of politics of the present. So obviously contemporary accelerationists are not keen on restraint and in favor of acceleration. In a sense, it's a kind of welcoming of the Antichrist, although this in a more Nietzschean sense of the welcoming of a figure of apparent evil who would in fact herald the transcendence of the present. And this connects with other kind of understandings of accelerationism we could talk about. The Nietzschean drive of accelerationism to the future suggests the need for speed as abandoning restraint and redemption. Now, my invocation of the catechon is not the conservative figure of the state as in Schmitt. Instead, I want to suggest the catechon might be restraint suggested by past and present struggles that have tried to reform or rupture with an unrestrained capitalism. In a certain sense, these delay the end, the final conflict or redemptive moment of entry into post-capitalism. I would, however, suggest that there is not a simple choice here between reform or revolution. Instead, past forms of reform, themselves often the results of revolutionary struggles, need defending and reactivating in the forms of struggles for the decommodification of life. So this, I just want to suggest, is a way of giving the pause that Sarah mentioned a kind of content or a form or substance, rather than just a kind of negative let's stop, of giving it some kind of content. The pause would be this focus on the present as a kind of moment of impasses and struggles. Let me just conclude. So, yes, so what I'm trying to do here is then suggest that rather than jumping to the past or to the future, we bring into focus the present. And that something like the catechoner's pause or the emergency break might involve that bringing into focus. And obviously that is rather typical of the tradition of Hegel and Marx. As you'll know, the whole stress of Hegel and Marx is hic Rhodus, hic salta. Here's Rhodes, jump here or dance here, or here is the rose, as it gets, they play on this little phrase, the rose in the cross of the present. So, here, deal with now, deal with the present. And I think that's interesting also if we think about contemporary theory, which is also sort of divided by a turn to a deep ontological wounding or to a redemptive and utopian future. Perhaps I think of the work of Giorgio Agamben, which actually manages to combine both those figures in bare life and in the redemptive account of animal life. So that's what I'm kind of suggesting. Now, obviously, the bleakness of the present might seem to demand that we turn away. And yet, just to finish, Seneca in his letters approves the maxim of the Stoic Hecato: cease to hope and cease to fear. Hope and fear go together for Seneca, like a prisoner and the escort he is handcuffed to. It is our capacity for memory and for foresight that creates fear, creating situations of suspense and anxiety as we focus on past and future. Instead, it may be that a Stoic practice in which we confine our unhappiness to the present might help us overcome that unhappiness. And now I will pass over to Sarah. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm
No
just
worries.
down. All right. This is great. Thank you. So as Ben mentioned, this is an experiment to see what you all think about bringing together sort of a causal element of loving us that I'm working on, that when I have been reading Ben's work struck me as connected. And so I sort of look forward to having this opportunity to talk in this context. And thank you to Carl and Roger for inviting me, and thank you to Ben for participating and for that wonderful stage setting and content on the puzzle. So I'll just sort of back up and share a little bit sort of broad about what my current projects, as Roger mentioned, there's 3 of them now, but what they have in common, let's just say that I'll focus on today, is something, it's a project on Levinas that I call the Phenomenology of Pause. And it's also ultimately a phenomenology of pardon and pause in a way that will hopefully become clear by the end. But obviously I won't have a chance to sort of walk through all of the pieces of what that project is. Just to sort of say it's a project on early Levinas, and why I emphasize that is that it's I'm interested in what I wind up doing in the project is develop a really new lexicon for talking about Levinas. And so it's up through, it's the stuff in the 30s and 40s, and it even goes into totality and infinity, but only the first part, like part 2, not the sort of famous stuff about face and responsibility and infinity and all of that. I'm not interested in that, even though I think that what I'm doing in the project is directly related to that. But I'm trying to sort of go to an earlier time, a much more, well, I want to say a much more embodied and concrete Levinas. Levinas is always embodied in concrete, but it's more obvious in the lexicon that I'm helping him create for this earlier phase. So this is where I highlight out the language of pause and a phenomenology of pause. And for those, including Ben and others who don't normally go into phenomenology, and this might still apply to what I'm ultimately going to present today as at a disconnect perhaps from this, from some of the elements of this project. But I will just sort of caution that Levinas in general isn't a regular phenomenologist. So if you don't like phenomenology, give it a chance when it comes to Levinas. But then I would even go so far as to say that even if you're like, yeah, Sarah, I know about Levinas's phenomenology, I also don't like that, I would still say, well, hang on for my project, because my project is going on this earlier stuff, which is so much more embodied. Again, I don't actually think it's actually more embodied, but it's more clear how embodied it is, that you might like it. So whatever you don't like about phenomenology, my project overcomes that. Okay, and if I don't manage to convince you of that today, it's just because I don't have enough time. But okay, so that is a phenomenology of pause. It's on stuff that's not the regular Levinas stuff. And it also connects up with a couple of words in this lexicon that I will draw on today, but I want to just sort of highlight out up front that sort of that they're in this register together. And they actually all start with the letter P, which was not on purpose, but when it happened, I was like, that's an indicator that I'm on the right track. And so it's pause, paradox, pardon, and past. And all of that towards the politics. So what are you going to do? That worked out perfectly. As and my last name is Pessin. The whole thing is really just, at this point, that's all I need to say. But in addition to that, I'll add that the relationship between, so the phenomenological piece relates to a politics for in the sort of more popular Levinas lexicon that perhaps if some of you have worked more on Levinas, you might know it under the header of sort of ethics is an optics for politics. In my project, because I'm sort of using a pre-ethics lexicon that has ethical implications, but we'll leave that aside, or in his normal sense of ethics, it's not, again, it's not a different project, but it's a different lexicon. So in the way I speak of it, it's that his phenomenological construction of a subject inflects a politics. What inflects means is something that we could talk about later, and it's, you know, that obviously has a lot built into it, and so I don't want to just gloss past that, but I do want to highlight that out, that the project is ultimately what I emphasize as a 2-tier project, which is why even though in a moment I'll come to some pieces of connection with Benjamin and with Marx, there's ultimately going to be always a different, and with Derrida even, there's always going to be with Levinas a sort of different something happening because of these 2 tiers. The phenomenological construction of a subject and how that inflects a politics. So I just want to sort of stage that out in that way. And in sum, the pausal element is my project is ultimately constructing or looking at how Levinas constructs a pausal subject that inflects a politics of pause. So that's sort of like maybe the overarching way, even if anything I say beyond this gets into weeds and you're like, I don't know what you're talking about. That's kind of like the overarching way that I see my project as connecting up to this. So now let me just say, together with Ben's work, some of the elements. So, and I understand that the way Ben is presenting it, especially as he's talking about even further work, that it's not so much, you know, one of anti-accelerationism and accelerationism, maybe that one is for sure the good one and one is for sure the bad one. But certainly in the spirit of malign velocities, I definitely enjoyed the anti-accelerationist impulse. And this is why in the project, to the extent that I'm looking at, even though obviously Ben isn't doing phenomenology, to the extent though that the phenomenology in Levinas around a subject, whatever subject is and whatever phenomenology is, which are all much more complicated than just something very clunky, whatever they're really doing for Levinas, they're designed and related to inflecting a politics. And so when I read about an anti-accelerationist politics, I feel like saying that whatever the Levinasian politics is anti-accelerationist. So that's sort of one of the pieces of connection. The other pieces of connection across Benjamin and Marx and Ben's work is sort of the emphasis on a kind of emancipatory space. And again, just even in the level of the generation through struggle of a just society, and as opposed to, in the accelerationist context, as Ben describes it, a disenchanted redemption, which simply emphasizes, as Ben describes it, the violent moment of creative destruction. I'm looking with, I believe, his project, as well as with Benjamin and Marx, on a sort of just society that is generated through struggle. And I like that Ben is here emphasizing it in terms of the present, so I think those are connected. And then lastly, I'll just say that I think my project also has something in it which has a bit of that negative force, maybe not only, but in that space of obviously Ben's last book on the persistence of the negative, and Benjamin obviously, well, it can be seen as giving a negative force to emancipation, the way that Michael Lowy in his Fire Alarm book describes that in Benjamin is sort of the negative force to utopian emancipation, is to say that there's no allusion to an end to the conflict, but rather, so there's no such illusion of an end to a conflict, but rather striving for something that, I don't know, we might call a without domination space. So those are just some of the broad ways that I wanted to connect my project to some of the work that, how Ben connects with Benjamin and Benjamin to Marx, like some of the overarching ways that I see my project in that space. And now I'll sort of go a little bit further into the details of my project, which will obviously differ from these in some ways. So one of the ways I describe my project is covenantal, or a term that I like to use is covenant-evental. That is not a term in Levinas, not even in the early Levinas, not I mean, obviously covenant is a Jewish term, so I'm sure you could find it somewhere in Levinas, but that's not as if like his main emphasis, he's not calling it that, but I'm highlighting that language. And part of what I mean by that is, well, actually part of why I do that, frankly, is because I find that in a both Christian and post-Christian academic space, it's very jarring to hear words from sort of Old Testament stuff. So I do it on purpose because I think that's helpful. But also relatedly, it conjures up the notion of covenant, the sort of three main pieces that actually relate to the frame that I just provided, which is something to do with interhuman justice, right? Some kind of a covenantal space that signals that. And in all of that also related to something to do with the past, but interestingly, not in the sense of past that I really like how Ben emphasizes that the accelerationists, for all their emphasis on the future, is kind of doing a nostalgia for the past, not that kind of sense of past, a different sense of past that actually is a past that is in the present. So with Ben's emphasis on present, this is where I'm going to come to with Levinas. So in other words, why am I using the word covenant? Sidebar, because I think the Academy needs to hear a lot of Jewish words and other words from different positionalities. That's one reason, honestly. But the other reason, and they're not unrelated actually to the other point, which is, but let me leave that aside for now. The other reason is because, right, that conjures up something about some kind of a negotiation between the people in the past, or something between you and God, but let's just say between people. So that's why I use the notion of covenant, because it's going to be important to me to focus on interhuman justice. And I know that Ben in his work talks about not reverting to the human. I don't know that I'm doing anything that is going to violate that, but I'd like to hear more about what he meant by that towards the end of the Milan Velocities book, because it's whatever it is of a kind of interhuman search for justice related to something in the past and related to a pause. Those are like the three elements of what I mean by covenantal mentality. And I actually contrasted in some of my work specifically with what I'll call, a kairotic eventality, and sort of to the extent that I like that Ben is using the notion of a non-Schmidt sense of a catacon to talk about the present. I'm focusing on a sense of kairos, which is very much future oriented in a kind of way that is perhaps, to Ben's point, also nostalgic for a past, but I haven't thought about that yet. But it's certainly future oriented, all steam ahead, all at full frenzy. And so the covenantal moment is a pausal moment in contrast to the covenant evental moment is a moment in contrast to that kairotic evental space. And again, I identify the kairotic evental, whether it's in a Deleuze, for whom we dive headfirst into capital's deterritorialization lines of flight. Again, it's like a frantic frenzy future, or whether it's Zizek, who at least in the last election, I don't know what he's voting for this time, but was sort of super proud of voting for Trump to help break the thing down so we can get to the next phase. Again, frantic frenzy future, or even if we're talking, and I don't know if I can coin this sort of term of ontological accelerationism to describe Heidegger, both in Being and Time and in his later work, of a kind of ontological acceleration in a Heidegger where, again, and he is overtly engaging in a kairotic notion from his reading of Kierkegaard and Paul's. I mean, that's very explicitly kairotic, where again, I would identify that as an ontological acceleration, which is again, frantic frenzy future of an authentic propulsion forward into possibility in a way that even with facticity and historicity is nonetheless unmoored from a past and certainly unmoored from the interhuman element. So those are all kinds of energies of the accelerationist kairotic in the way that I'm talking about it, to which I contrast this covenantal motion or moment in Levinas. And here, to start to get to the Levinas piece, let me first sort of kind of in contrast to that kairotic futural speeding moment, sort of look, as Ben did, at Benjamin and looking at the emergency break alongside a sense of pastness, which is not the nostalgic sense of pastness, where in contrast to that kind of accelerationist impulses, we can look to Benjamin's emergency break as a sort of, again, right, an interruption that also that prevents further loss of life, an interruptive politics that refuses to just sort of sink into the, treat, as Noyce says, treat capital on its own terms, and is aware of the destructiveness of production. So again, it's a kind of interruption to prevent, I would say, loss of life related to his sense of pastness, which Lowy in his Fire Alarm book, which is a study on the concept of history, I think nicely describes in Benjamin as Benjamin's, quote, appeal to see history from the standpoint of the victims, end quote. So really in Benjamin, I see that there is a connection between the pausal interruption and the interhuman justice and the past. So in a way, the covenantal elements that I just identified as past, interhuman, and pause are all also present in Benjamin, as it turns out. Those three kind of go together in his thinking. And here I want to say that's interesting. And yet what I want to do with Levinas, what a Levinasian politics opens to is completely consistent with what I just described in Benjamin, which I take it as consistent with Ben's work as well. That kind of a space of a past and interhuman and the pause completely seems consistent in the Levinasian politics of pause I'm interested in. Is one might say that it is perfectly consistent with and supportive of that kind of politics. And yet, what I'm going to now turn to for my remaining minutes, and apologies, I didn't look at the clock, so we're just going to go with it. At some level, at some point, this was time for 22 minutes, so at some point, I'm sure it's going to be a little longer. Apologies all around. But bottom line is that I'm now going to turn for maybe another 10 minutes or so to a kind of element in Levinas which goes beyond that, or we would say goes below that. Turning back, as I said at the beginning, that Levinas has two tiers, I want to now turn to the phenomenological subject and a kind of pausal emphasis on a kind of emphasis on pause and pastness connected to an interhumanness, which is actually different from what I've just described in terms of that, what we might call covenantal moment in Benjamin. In the project in Levinas, the covenantal is actually related to the thing that I'm about to say, which is a different sense of pastness and pause that I want to just now share. And I don't know 100% how it inflects to the political, but I have a deep sense that it inflects partially to the Benjamin and partially to the anti-accelerationist, all of that, and perhaps also it implicates other elements to what that anti-accelerationist sort of space might look like in the political. So I hope that's clear what I'm doing now. I'm now kind of going down the level to Levinas's phenomenological construction of the subject with a different sense of pause and past than even the interesting one that I just mentioned for Benjamin. Okay, so let me start that with looking at hauntology. When I say that, hauntology, you're maybe thinking of Derrida and specters of Marx. I don't know if this is well known, but I certainly didn't realize until I started studying more early Levinas that this is in Levinas. I generally tend to think anything I like about Derrida, he got from Levinas. We'll have to debate that or whatever, but I think this is one of those things. So, and what Derrida does with it, by the way, is different because, again, in all these different ways, whether it's Ben's work, whether it's Marx's work, whether it's Benjamin's work, or whether it's Derrida's work, those are one-tiered, whatever that means exactly. Whereas in Levinas, there's this two-tier process, whatever that means exactly, but that means that there's something different that's always going on. And so let's leave Derrida aside for a moment, because whatever Derrida does with hauntology is actually, I think, connected in its best moments to what I'm about to say about Levinas, but is ultimately not the same kind of thing, because Derrida is not talking about a subject, he's not biting that bullet, and so maybe there's a plus to that, but there's also minuses to that. So let me go to Levinas. And so to Levinas's hauntology, Levinas loves Shakespeare, and in his early writings, even in his prisoner of war notebooks and in the early writings in the 40s, he's talking about Hamlet and other Shakespeare. And so if we talk about Hamlet, we have the haunting of the son by the father theme. In some of his early works, in like 1947, he has an essay, Being Jewish, in which he takes that kind of thematic of the haunting of a spirit of a father and a son into an overtly kind of Christian theological direction, and kind of takes a moment to kind of critique Christianity. Generally, Levinas is very favorable of Christianity, and he greatly enjoys Judeo-Christian relations, as do I, but as do I, he will sometimes also critique Christian frames. And here's one of those moments where he'll take the idea, he'll say, look, in Christianity, the father, God is the brother to you in Christianity, where in Judaism, God is the father. And so if you see what I'm doing there with my hand, we have right here a pastness element. Levinas really doesn't care about theology, right? He's not a theologian, so it's not that he's saying, oh, Judaism's God is behind us. That's a bizarre, he doesn't really care where it is, but where he does care is that the theology in Christianity is too simultaneity driven. And I guess this is interesting because in that respect, it is too much of a past into a future that Levinas sees as a problem. There needs to be some kind of a sense of origin. And this is a kind of pastness, but as we'll get to in a minute, it's a pastness in the instant. It's not sort of just talking about like past, like, oh, we really need a religion where we can look to the traditions from the past. It's not that kind of a conservative sense. And P.S., anytime as a Jewish scholar, I talk about covenant and pastness, I'm off to a bad start because people are immediately assuming that I'm doing something super traditionalist or super oppressive or whatever. No, none of those things. So when I say the past and the father is in the past, says Levinas in the case of God, he's interested in a dynamic of somehow a kind of look olderness, if I may put it that way, which directly relates to the notion of pause. The idea of a pastness of a God behind us for Levinas is more interesting. He's not interested in theology, is a motion, as it were, to speak paradoxically of a pausal motion. It's a kind of way of a looking over one's shoulderness in the human condition. if I may. And so if we leave aside the stuff where he talks about it in terms of theology, the part that then is interesting is in his early work, and this is where my book is basically an extended commentary on his 1947 From Existence to the Existent, sometimes translated Existence and Existence. Levinas there, and also into Totality and Infinity, again, the part 2, which is the interiority stuff, which is not famous part of that book that people skip over. In all of those early works up until the first part of Totality and Infinity, you can find these strong emphases on embodiment and concretion of the human condition. So whatever you like or don't like about phenomenology or whatever subject, he's talking about the concrete embodied experience of being human. And in that structure, there is to him the main emphasis that we just saw him say as a critique on Christianity and, oh, look, Judaism has the Father behind us, in something that I call embirthment. As a basic structure of human experience, we are embirthed. We have parents, and even PS, if the parents are a petri dish, it doesn't matter. It's that we have a before us, and that experience of pastness that I'm speaking of is in the instant, if you see what I mean. He's not, yeah, fine, parents actually come before us in time, but that's not the point. The point is it's a structure of embirthment, as I call it, which is part of the basic structure of concrete human embodiment, which is related to this over-the-shoulderness lookingness, to the idea that there is another person or persons to whom I am related. So notice here, pastness and the pause is in this kind of like getting kind of a moment in which my own constitutiveness has to do with a kind of getting stuck on a looking over my shoulderness, right? So do you feel what I'm saying? It's a pastness in the present that has to do with a pause in relationship to a paradox. And the paradox is that this is something, the parent is something which I am both, it's a paradox of dependence and independence. It's something on which I am dependent and from which I am independent. And that paradox for him opens up in a very important way that, and I don't have time and I'm gonna kind of wrap up here. He also uses that structure to describe like boring stuff, like eating bread. And actually I have a section in my book, which is actually this whole sort of Judeo-inflected Eucharistic intervention, where for Levinas, the whole idea of body and bread, everything, Trinitarian mystery, incarnational paradoxes, Eucharistic paradoxes, for Levinas, that all of that energy is used to describe the basic reality of a human being embodied. And so I'll leave out the stuff about bread, but I'll say that as it relates to this embirthment, which is a kind of in the instant, in my own constitutiveness, kind of past relatedness, related to a pause in my own self, relating to that space, he also then relates that to then what I'll call enablement, which is not just with respect to a parent, but with respect to any human. Why he wants to put them, as it were, behind us, let's leave that aside. But let me just tell you that he is doing that. He does that with bread as well. Everything is behind us. And so this is a very beautiful conception of embodiment. Again, and P.S., this is what he means by immanence and transcendence. So I won't get into that. We could talk about that in the Q&A, but that's all. That's all it is. And it's not all, it's a lot. It's a beautiful a lot. That's where transcendence comes in, because we are both interior to and exterior to ourselves with respect to something that is behind us in the instant. It's a past in the instant. Okay, so when we bring in the neighbor in that positionality, hopefully you can feel the space of it's a pastness in the instant, that which comes before me. It's related to a paradox of, again, same with the neighbor and with the stranger. Neighbor includes stranger, or maybe it's better to say stranger. I am connected to them. I am dependent and independent, so that paradox is there. It's the pause, because that's the almost constitution of the subject, is in that mix. It's like a unable to, it's a kind of being pulled back in a way with respect to oneself. So that's the pause. And as becomes very clear in the enablement, more so even than the embirthment, but it's in both, is pardon. What do I mean by pardon? I'll just wrap up quickly to say, I think in the very broadest sense, I describe it as a hope for pardon. Hope for pardon is a terrible expression in various contexts, because when I say hope, people hear something very optimistic. So let me assure you, it's not optimistic. It's a very difficult space in which you recognize that you owe a debt of some sort, and you plead for pardon in a way from the other as a basic constitutive way of relating, being within oneself. I will just quickly end off to say that what that all means is, again, this is at the level of constructing the subject. This then is designed to inflect a politics. So what other kind of politics does this inflect than one in which there is a pause with respect to the other, for a space of a kind of struggle, for justice, a struggle for the public services, for the other pieces that Ben talks about in his book. What else is that in terms of how it inflects? And in terms of, again, a causal politics, which is not accelerating, which is not just frenzying itself into the destructiveness of production to get to the next phase, but that pauses with Benjamin to sort of take account also of the voices of the victims from the past. All of that to me seems to be what this structure inflects. And the last piece that it inflects is a structure of debt, but not in a neoliberal sense of debt, but in a sense of debt that has a Marxist underpinning to it. That I'll end with Graeber. When Graeber is again doing a one-level project, he's not doing a phenomenological inflexopolitics kind of thing. But what I see this inflecting is this political space that also has to do with what does it mean to have a political space that is living in the reality of interhuman debt. I don't mean neoliberal debt. What I mean is what Graeber means. So I'll just end with this brief story that Graeber, in his debt book, so obviously Graeber's not a fan of debt, right? In his debt book, I really like that he cites the author Margaret Atwood, who cites the author Ernest Thompson Seton. And it goes like this. Seton apparently says that he had a bill presented to him on his 21st birthday by his father. And it was basically a bill for all of the things that all of the costs associated with him, including his hospital delivery fee, all the way up until the present. So that Seton, the author, nature writer, Ernest Thompson Seton, writes that this is what his father gave him on his 21st birthday was his bill, and that he says he paid off the bill. Margaret Atwood cites this story and says, wow, she says, when I first read this, I thought, wow, the father's a real ass. But then she says, now I'm wondering. So in the context there, she's wondering whether, we could say in context of like, get rid of all kinds of debt structures, because that's the problem of the current capital, and neoliberal frame. It's not just that it's the neoliberal version of debt. Let's just get rid of interhuman debt. So that's why Margaret Atwood says, maybe there is something to that. So Graeber cites this whole thing of her citing the other guy and then saying, oh, I think it makes sense. And he, who is writing a book critiquing debt, basically says, no, that does not make sense. Of course, we want to get rid of certain kinds of debt, but we do not want to get rid of basic interhuman debt. No, we do not all want to write a note to each other and write each other's off. He even says, like, when we go out for a beer or a drink, you never say, oh, I'm going to make it up. You keep that. It's a constant. It's a constant. I'll get the next one. I'll get the next one. Nobody's looking to live in a political environment in which we're all actually without debt to one another, says David Graeber. And in that respect, I find it very beautiful. And he refers to it as a baseline communism, related to, of course, Marx's notion of from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. And so I would like to just end there to say, thinking about Levinas makes me think about a phenomenological space that inflects a political space, a pausal phenomenology and a pausal politics. And in there are the spaces of interhuman justice related to a interhuman debt, related to not just sort of shooting forward into the future. Okay, thank you.
Well, I think I can speak for everyone and say thank you to Drs. Pessin and Noyes for a stimulating juxtaposition of presentations on pause and pausal politics. I know that right now we typically take a short break, and speaking of time, I will make sure and clock this so that it's about a 5-minute break. I think that would give you the opportunity to pause as needed in the most embodied, concrete way. And also to put in your questions, comments into the chat. That way we can go in order of comment or question as soon as we return. And I'll leave it off at that.
¿Ah, sí? ¿Y por
Okay, so technically we're at 5 minutes, and I know that some will be slowly returning to our gathering, but in the interest of time, perhaps we can begin with a question that Professor Pessin had regarding the intersections, I believe. If you want to frame that, Sarah.
Great, thank you. So Ben, I would just love to hear just your initial thoughts. If you see points of intersection, and where are the points of disintersection? And relatedly, I know that you speak in the book, that you're not looking for a return to the human. So I was just curious if maybe related to that, you're not suggesting return to the human. Just to sort of see if anything that I said seemed consistent with that or inconsistent with that. And then relatedly, when you ended today and talking about the Stoic sense, in the book you talk about sort of, avoiding false consolation of inbuilt hope. And I'm 100% in agreement with, when I talk of hope, it's not that kind of hope. And in fact, when Benjamin in the book on Benjamin, Lowy says that let's not talk of Benjamin in terms of hope, but in terms of what he describes as organizing pessimism. Again, the kind of hope that I had in mind in what I even talked about was not meant to sort of suggest, it's a present related focus on the subject in this sort of weird way related to politics. So I do like the idea of the present. That seems to me to resonate across the two projects. And then again, yes, there's definitely maybe I wouldn't first go to Stoic, just because I kind of almost like a kind of optimism pessimism paradox almost better, but maybe that's what you think of by Stoic. But yeah, just some of would love just to hear your thoughts on sort of, again, obviously your project is a phenomenological one, so that's going to be a difference, but would just love to hear your thoughts and to see whether you see why I enjoy reading your work as I'm working on this project.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I mean, you packed a lot into a very short presentation, so there was kind of a lot there to think about and a lot there to unpack. Yeah, I guess what did occur to me? I mean, I guess this might sound like a tangent, but I guess I was thinking a lot about Winnicott, oddly, the psychoanalyst, as you were talking particularly about the relationship to parents, paradox, and debt, partly because I teach it, so it's just on my mind recently. But I guess you're right to say, in a sense, that I'm not a phenomenologist, so you could argue that there is a kind of missing subject in my work. There's an implied one about kind of political subjectivity, but there's not a kind of conception of the subject at work there, clearly. And obviously for accelerationists, as I argue in the book, their conception of the subject is one that's kind of transformable and kind of very much ruptured from the matrix of the family. I think that there's one thing that's quite consistent in accelerationism. It's an antagonism to the family form, if you like, and to the parent. It's an-Oedipal, it's anti-Oedipal. It takes that from Deleuze and Guattari, or from Lyotard. So it's go all the way back to the Italian futurists, I guess, for this kind of notion of a kind of birth without parents, a kind of self-parthenogenesis, I want to say, but self-birthing. So yeah, and I'm kind of thinking just from what you were saying, really, like the way I might fill in that gap or think about that gap was really just through kind of, like I say, through Winnicott. And Winnicott's interested in paradox through the transitional object, the teddy bear or the blanket. Winnicott just makes this point, which I think seems to me to resonate with what you're saying, that we form ourselves as independent through negotiating dependence. We kind of start as a baby in a state of absolute dependence. As I say to my students, babies are useless. They can't do anything. They can't tell you which mobile phone to buy. They can't tune your TV. They can't do anything for themselves. They require constant care, and for Winnicott, that care is gradually kind of withdrawn and negotiated, and partly through a transitional object. So in a weird way, you form yourself as a subject through an object, and you form yourself as independent through a relationship of dependence. And we all know that part of the one way you can make people fail to be independent is to make them independent too soon. You push children out too rapidly, too violently, they lose their inner resources. Winnicott tells this nice story about evacuees, children during the war who were evacuated from London and other major cities to be housed with new families. And he said they would sit around, he was part of the program looking after them. And he said, like, some children would sit there kind of reading a book and not doing anything and sitting on the bed. And he said those were the ones he really worried about, because their good behavior meant they had lost faith in the world. The ones who would damage things or write their name on the wall or cause trouble had some faith that the world was still there for them. Whereas the ones who turned inward in a kind of self-dependence and a self-reliance had actually lost that sense, I think, of indebtedness that you mentioned, a kind of positive sense of debt, that we recognize a relationship to the other or to other people, that is not negative. And I guess that's something I would take away in my own very primitive way, not kind of phenomenological, that, the sense of relation being important. There's a British Marxist of the 1930s, it's very unfashionable, Christopher Caldwell, but he says something that I think is very true. And he says that bourgeois ideology fundamentally implies that you're independent, and that relations come second, and all kinds of relations are secondary to your primary independence, the kind of Robinson Crusoe myth. And I think that still largely holds true. So I think this is a full intersection, but I think that's what I was thinking about in your kind of discussion.
Thank you so much for that. I want to make sure that both of our guest speakers can see the questions in the chat that have been written down. Okay, great. So I guess we'll move on to Roger Green's question regarding the sort of aesthetics of the return to nature, the so-called becoming indigenous. He's contextualized it nicely. So whoever wants to go first there.
Sarah, do you want to start? Or I can start.
Go ahead. I'm collecting my thought there.
I mean, I would say that obviously accelerationism presents itself as a critique of any kind of return.
Excuse me, could I intervene here? And could you read the question, because we're recording this? And
sure.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, Carl. So Roger writes, so he's thinking with Benjamin's talk, especially of Westworld, which of course is nostalgic for a 1970s film that included an aesthetics of the Old West, which were a big part of hippie or psychedelic aesthetics of an archaic revival. Wondering how either or both of you might critique this aesthetics of a return to nature. And as I said, the becoming indigenous, i.e. electronic dance music, but also kind of folk Americana nostalgia that you're probably both aware of, and it obviously elsewhere also.
Yeah, so as I was saying, I think accelerationism presents itself as antagonistic to those kinds of nostalgias and those kinds of looking to the past and to nature. And to hippie, if you read Mark Fisher's work, it's very clearly founded on a kind of punk antagonism to hippie, you know, the famous "never trust a hippie" phrase. And I guess partly due to age, I was Mark, same generation as Mark, I share some of that distrust of return to nature and those movements. And in the kind of revival of dance music in the 80s, there was a tension between, I told you I could turn it into a discussion of dance music, and I will. There was a tension between the kind of new rave, standing in fields, kind of hippie, spiral tribe, new tribal culture stuff, versus jungle and drum and bass, which were more suburban, not urban, I think, interestingly, suburban. I'm interested because that's where I come from. And a kind of aesthetics of speed and kind of inhuman and therefore seemingly anti-natural. So I do, I must admit, share some of the accelerationist kind of suspicion around those sorts of kinds of moments of appropriation or claiming for nature. At the same time, I think, obviously, I've become kind of less convinced of that and more convinced of kind of how we need to think about engagements with nature that would not be these sorts of appropriative ones. I mean, I think it's what's interesting in your question as well. We've got now kind of meta nostalgia. We've got a nostalgia for another aesthetic. We're not even talking about a nostalgia for nature. We're talking about a TV show that represents a nostalgia for a particular aesthetic form. And I think this is kind of interesting at the moment, you know, where it's kind of, you know, it's meta nostalgia rather than nostalgia itself. So I guess I think within that, you know, there is a kind of capacity to criticize, the aesthetics and politics of those forms of nostalgia, which rely on particular class positions, rely on particular claims to nature, particularly appropriative moments, and particularly often ignoring the actual indigenous populations and people who are involved, and constructing a fantasy of the past. That again is a kind of, you know, there's a symmetry with the accelerationist desire to integrate with the machine and these kind of fantasies of integration with nature, that perhaps that might be a kind of starting point for a mutual criticism.
Yeah, and I'll follow up in saying that, yeah, I definitely have a suspicion of any kind of a return to nature aesthetic, but keeping in mind a couple of pieces. I almost feel like, and this, yeah, I don't, let me just say, I'm concerned in general about sort of putting too much weight on the medium, in this case, nature. I think I sometimes like to talk about it in terms of sort of the comportment as opposed to the thing to which one is comported. In this respect, obviously, I want a space in which there's greater care for nature. So obviously, that's important. I also want to make clear that obviously indigenous relations to nature and teachings on nature are also a key piece. So that's not what I mean to be suspicious of, but a kind of nostalgic return to some kind of a nature that's strikes me as a particular comportment, which I find worrisome. So it's not so much the nature piece, it's the something about the nostalgia, or quite frankly, in both. I mean, the way that Ben just put it in terms of the sort of new wave and the drum and bass, like the different kinds of musical approaches, and whether we divide it up into, return to nature or rejection of return to nature. I'm suspicious of both of those because those comportments seem overly hard baked.
Thank you both. Your sort of responses to that critique of return, and appreciate that framing. I think the next one up is from Taylor, who is curious about the power dynamics of the implementation of the pause in politics. In light of this accelerationist moment, she writes, we are currently experiencing in regard to the swearing in of a new Supreme Court justice, discuss the power dynamics of who defines terms and implementation of the pause in politics.
I'll start, Ben, since you luckily don't have to worry directly about, you haven't been probably losing as much sleep about this one as many of some of the rest of us here. We'll give you a minute to think about the case. But yeah, I guess at least in the way that I'm constructing and thinking with Levinas about a kind of way that a certain kind of sense of subjectivity, which PS I'm fine to think of as actually a kind of fiction, and just whatever I mean by a kind of a story of the subject and how that inflects into a politics of pause. In my own work, I tend to think of that as inflecting in ways that are maybe certain kinds of traits. For example, a pivot proneness and a capacity to sort of I like William Connolly's discussion of agonistic respect and his notion of contestability, a kind of operating in the world with a modality in which, and again, I mean, Connolly doesn't speak of subjectivity in that way either, but still the way in which it's just some kind of a comportment element that I think about in terms of pivot proneness and in terms of ambiguity and in terms of precarity and in terms of certain kinds of more openness and Connolly's notion of contestability. All of that does not exactly answer the question. When Critchley, for example, talks about Levinas's inflection into a political space, he talks about a plumb line. And I rather like that, and I'll sometimes talk about a plumb line politics, which is to say, it doesn't say exactly who gets to it, right. It doesn't say that. And I mean, I think Levinas is quite aware that the political and the entry of the third always makes things multiply complicated, which is also part of why any kind of sort of utopianism that envisions things ultimately working out in very clear ways doesn't make sense to me through a Levinasian lens or through my own lens. So it doesn't exactly answer the question of who defines the terms. It just is, so I don't know how to exactly address that, other than to say that if we are thinking in a Levinasian frame of living in a more sort of contestable way, there are ways that, to Critchley's level of like a plumb line, there are ways that that I think this allows us to be political agents in a different kind of way. I'll just say as a quick aside that some of the adjectives that I described, maybe not pivot prone and contestable, but like the open and the sort of precarious and paradoxical modality in a political space, I know that those have come under attack as sort of like, postmodern kinds of like political comportments that are sort of, passe because you know, in an accelerationist project like Deleuze and Guattari, they will say that you know, that's actually the neoliberal situation, is that everything is just completely open, and so that, you know, for me to be bringing in a kind of open comportment to the current situation, they would say doesn't make sense. Or to put it in the way that Negri critiques, I think he's critiquing Derrida, but to similar kinds of adjectives about what kind of comportment we would want in a political context. You know, he basically says to Derrida, which I think he's saying is Derrida, but would say to me right now, which is, oh, you know, why am I talking about openness and precarity as somehow as possible comportment that would be a solution to the contemporary problem? Negri says that's like knocking on an open door, because there's too much openness and there's too much whatever. So I would just say I don't actually see that as a critique, because and again, there are minuses maybe to talking about subjectivity in the way I do with Levinas, but at least the plus is to say that one has a comportment which is open is very much against what's going on in a neoliberal frame. So to say that, oh, this is about openness and difference, neoliberal like implosions are about too much openness and difference, so therefore how would this be a solution to that? Answer is that's a red herring. The kind of open precarious comportment and an interhuman debt that Levinas is referring to is literally the opposite of what is reflected in a contemporary kind of environment. So to say, I don't know exactly who gets to decide it, other than to say that if we were comporting ourselves differently and cultivating ourselves in our politics to be comported differently, I think our politics would work out differently.
Yeah, so, yeah, I mean, I will just speak in general terms because I'm not a particular expert on the US. But I would say that in general, the problem is, you know, any kind of, at least what I think I mean by the pause or the kind of political things I'm talking about to be implemented would demand collectivities, the masses, as they used to say. You know, that's how I think politics, particularly a kind of left politics, however you want to define that, is done. That's how it's required to be done. And therefore, I'm not very hopeful. Because the situation does not appear to be good. And I think that's what I was sort of saying, that it's kind of understandable why people might turn away from the present or try to imagine a way out that looks to other moments, because the present is not a seemingly particularly tractable or engaging horizon, at least in our two respective countries. Yes, I could say a lot more about suicidal death cults at this point, and things like that. So yeah, I think the implementation of the political implementation is a kind of collective matter. I guess what I'm doing I don't know if I describe it as political, you know, that's kind of an interesting question. I guess I'm trying to kind of pose correctives at the level of ideas and a kind of inquiry into the kind of assumptions behind certain kind of theoretical moves and moments. I think what I would just add is there's something interesting here about the role of the state. And I think that quite a few theoretical moves originate in a critique of the state that emerges out of a critique of social democracy, the social democratic state in the 1970s. And this is partly accounts for some of the things Sarah's saying about where confusion around words like open and the confusion around critiques of the state do start to not, I agree with you, not directly coincide, but can be made to kind of merge with neoliberal critiques of the state. So I think there's a problem where older languages get used and people don't there's a kind of replaying moves like from the 70s as though nothing has changed in the last 30 years. And that's why I would have like problems with punk. I turn everything into a conversation about music. Because part of the problem with punk was that its critique of the establishment was not necessarily a left critique. You know, people are professing surprise that John Lydon supports Trump. It's not necessary if you actually look at Lydon's career statements and what he did and does, to be totally surprised by that. You know, that a critique of the state that he articulated then might lead to an embrace of a figure like Trump now. So, I think there's some kind of call to kind of update maybe some of the kind of thinking. And I guess that's part of my critique of accelerationism, that they're replaying lots of moves in Lyotard, Deleuze and Guattari, that had a point then, they had a kind of galvanizing point, and yet maybe they are less effective now when you've got a kind of power politics situation where, figures like Trump and Johnson are kind of inhabiting anarchist or kind of particularly fluid modes of power, or just kind of overriding legal frameworks or accelerating particular processes. So I guess that's maybe behind some of my thinking, is maybe unpacking or considering some of the ways in which we are still replaying moves that not always were ineffective or may not still be effective, but might need kind of thinking about now.
Great, thank you both for that response. I believe our next question comes from Peter, and it was directed at Professor Noyes. Question around breaking or suspension as a cracking of the present. If you could say a little more about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, to get into this question, I just want to say that this concept of the pause, of freezing, of suspension, to me is just, it's such a mysterious area to take us, like a good mystery, in a way that the kind of like a temporal politics around past, present, and future kind of lead to a whole set of different impasses. But this idea of pausing somehow or another, I think, is such a fruitful way to kind of open up our temporal imaginations. Okay, so into the question would be that I guess I'm wondering if somehow or other, like my own reading is that the problem is not that we can't get into the present, that we can't get into a politics of now. My own approach is more that we're dominated by a kind of continual present, which subsumes the past, which territorializes the future. And so what I find interesting is, like, Benjamin, it seemed like your talk was that you wanted to bring us to the present, that you feel that the present has been lost. But my own instincts with Benjamin's work around suspension and breaking, and it's so elliptical that there's so many ways into this, but that it is a way of unseating a kind of present. And somehow or another, I'm curious if we can find certain kind of utopian dimensions or a kind of strange way into a kind of futural politics by the act of breaking and freezing. So I kind of want a kind of Benjaminian politics of breaking, not to just leave us into the present, but to provide a very unusual possible opening for a kind of futural politics. So your response.
Yeah, again, there's a lot of things to say about that. I mean, I guess I see where you're coming from about the kind of seamlessness of the present, or the way the present may seem to absorb the past and the future. I guess I'm also kind of thinking of Bergson. Bergson seems to be behind kind of a lot of Benjamin's thinking on temporality, and to some extent from what I've been reading for this around some of Levinas's. But I guess I was trying to argue that the present itself is fractured and divided. I agree with you. I don't think it is seamless. I think the present itself is still divided by the conflicts both of the past and towards the future. I guess I tend to like thinking with this concept of like trend lines or possibilities. That I think, I don't know if I used it the line in the talk, but that notion that science fiction is not about the future, but it's about the present. I think Jameson says it, but everyone says it, and I think that's kind of what's interesting, is that any attempt to imagine the future is still an imagination of the present, and it's still an attempt to kind of rupture with that present. So, yeah, I guess within that, I'm kind of trying to think about how we then might approach the present as not wholly kind of not wholly bad. You know, I think what's the line actually relates to that nature question. Breck says, let's not concentrate on the good old things, let's concentrate on the bad new. You know, it's like thinking that the present as itself a site that can be or is already kind of in fracture or tension. You know, not I think portraying the present as a kind of complete dystopia from which we must escape. You know, obviously we want things to be better, but I think to understand that involves kind of thinking that how that present has been formed and how that present might be engaged with and the limits of those possibilities.
Thank you so much for that. I want to move on to the next set of questions just so we can fit them in here, hopefully, with the time we have. The next question comes from Bryce, and it was directed at Sarah, hoping that Sarah could elaborate on the origins of Derrida's ontology in Levinas to maybe get a clearer idea of how nostalgia does or does not play into this idea of pause. I've always understood the term to mean a nostalgia for a naive vision of the future, which present understandings tell us is impossible, but seems I'm missing nuance here. So if you could speak to that a little bit, Sarah.
Yeah, and I was certainly, I don't, you know, I'll actually defer to Carl on what exactly this means in Derrida, but I just was surprised when I was studying Levinas to find him talking expressly about these hauntings, and in a way it just struck me because of other things that Derrida is clearly reading Levinas in many ways. So like I said earlier, the ways in which once you leave the sort of phenomenological project of subjectivity behind, as one does in Derrida, the ways that what I understand is meant in Levinas will wind up refracting into what is meant in Derrida. I don't know. I don't have a firm way to describe that story now. So it was more just as an aside of me just thinking that, like, oh, I saw, you know, I saw that, and then I realized that it was sort of Hamlet related. So that was just my sort of telling. But in a Levinasian space, the notion of the haunting in relationship to a past, this is, if anything, related to a kind of space of mourning, related to a space of interhuman. It has nothing to do with nostalgia, but I don't know if you meant with respect to Derrida. I'll defer. I'm not sure what exactly all the implications are, but to the extent that it's in Levinas, this is definitely not related to some kind of a sense of nostalgia. It's definitely related to a kind of engagement with subjectivity in a way that is in a tension, a kind of, I mean, in the way that Ben is just describing to Peter's question about some of the features of the present. And this, by the way, is what fascinates me about the Levinasian, whether or not we take a phenomenological subject as on face value or not. Even as a poetics, quite frankly, I like the way that it mirrors some of the features of a political space. And so the idea that the present is a sort of fractured thing, not just one seamless thing, that's very much the spirit of the Levinasian subject. It's an interrupted subject. And the relationship to those who are not ourselves. It's not nostalgic. It's a kind of interruptive encounter with the self. So yeah, that's my.
Excuse me, Sarah, since you invoked me here as a spirit, so to speak, just say quickly for clarification that the Derrida's hauntology is found most specifically in his very significant book, Spectres of Marx, which came out in the early 1990s. Derrida himself, as Sarah has heard me say, was haunted his whole life by Levinas. And so he takes I'm not familiar with where in Levinas that idea of haunting comes from, but it's about the future. It's not about subjectivity in Derrida. It's about what he calls democracy to come. Spectres of Marx both is future and past. It keeps coming back. It keeps returning, retour in French.
And I'll just add to that, Carl, that, and again, so this is an interesting conversation for another time about how this piece and other pieces between Levinas and Derrida, but definitely to the extent that this is a kind of pastness in the instant, which again, there's no, because that's what we're talking about is sort of odd subjectivity space, and certain kinds of ways of encountering and also pushing back against Bergson. So, but to the extent that he's talking about a kind of articulated instant, actually, right? So he's so concerned with, I mean, again, what Ben was saying before, at the sort of moment of the present, in a non-phenomenological sense, that the present be ruptured. Levinas is actually sort of looking at the instant of subjectivity as ruptured itself, as an articulated instant. So it's a similar, again, it's a inflection piece that I like as a poetics, if as nothing else. But there definitely is this idea, again, that Carl was just saying about a future that has to do with a past. I mean, for Levinas, the sense of pastness that I'm talking about is related to a rupturing of the self, and the rupturing of the self is very much related to the pursuit of an impossible justice that is always yet to come in Levinas as well. So even though there are differences, that there is that element of the justice yet to come flavor in Levinasian politics as well.
Just on hauntology, it's also, I guess, I think worth noting that Mark Fisher uses hauntology in a kind of more culturalist sense, and I think it connects up to his accelerationist views. They're not antagonistic. Again, it's this sort of leap to a kind of past to imagine a future for Mark. So there, his example of kind of hauntological moments is like in Burial, the artist, music artist, where you get kind of crackling, which is a sample, is a kind of weird use of the old nostalgic sound of the record. But now they've come back. So in a sense, a kind of hauntology there is used not in a Derridean way exactly, but in a way to kind of reactivate a past that could then leap into the future. So again, it's kind of interesting how maybe hauntology or the haunting emerges as this kind of interactive theme that can be kind of read or inflected in a few different ways. It seems almost like the flip side of accelerationism is this kind of dynamics or debate about haunting, maybe something about the kind of relationship between our kind of Gothic moment and our kind of accelerationist moment are quite kind of meshed together, as I spent a lot of my time watching horror films in general.
That's great. That was a wonderful aside. I think, wholly relevant, obviously. So thank you for that question, Bryce. I got to thinking as well about an art history essay out of UT. I think it's entitled Photographing Objects as Queer Practice. And it talks about the development of an affective archive. And it made me think about what Benjamin and Sarah both were saying, as well as Carl, not an archive in the sense of some sort of dry documentation that gets managed and kept and passed down, but one that gets returned in order to look ahead. It's affective, and I'm sure Sarah could probably say a bit about that later as well if we have time. Moving on to Carl's question, it's fairly lengthy, so I'll take some time if you want to read it with me here. For both Sarah and Ben, as they wish to weigh in, per Graeber, the problem of debt is the problem of the equality and equality of exchange. In Marxist theory, it's the phenomenon of exchange that gives rise to commodification, which gives rise of exploitation, which creates capital, from which we get capitalism. Marx's eschatology, i.e. Marx is from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs, as stated in his critique of the Gotha program, constitutes the eschatological abolition of the principle of exchange, which means the abolition of debt. I'm curious how a politics of pause addresses the political economical paradox of exchange and debt, and in particular, how would a Levinasian politics of pause have anything to do with it?
Yeah, I mean, so, at least in the frame of my project, which is in the frame of the Levinasian politics of pause, and this goes back to something I was saying that Taylor asked, I'd have to think about the exact details of a particular politics, in this case, a particular sort of Marxist playing out. The issue that I'm interested in is how his sort of account of subjectivity is a kind of mirror space of certain kinds of comportment that one takes on in a plumb line politics. So in other words, and with respect to debt, I'm interested in Graeber to the extent that in this mix that you're speaking of, I'm interested in the importance to Graeber of acknowledging this baseline communism as an interhuman debt. That to me is part of a question about comportment and what it means to do politics from an awareness of interhuman debt. The details of what the politics look like, and again, this goes to, it connects to my mind to how I was responding to Taylor. I don't mean to as a cop out. I mean, obviously one then needs to use that architecture to, as a plumb line, to approach individualized questions. And I don't know what to say at this moment about that particular question, other than I'm interested in what does it mean to conduct the political with a sense of, I mean, contrary to a sort of like friend enemy as the basis for the sort of political, what would it mean to have the political inflected by interhuman debt, not related to the thing that's being critiqued in either Graeber or Marx? So that's not really an answer other than to say, yeah, the project that I'm doing is looking to sort of think about what it means to inflect a general comportment at the political level. And I have heard in sort of critiques of neoliberal context, sort of a just, and again, this is the way that the Margaret Atwood is sort of talking about, sort of that this might implicate just sort of that there's something completely off base about having any kind of sense of debt whatsoever. And that just, that doesn't ring true to me, and I find it interesting and helpful that it doesn't ring true to Graeber, and it also doesn't ring true to Marx. So it's not an exact answer, but that's where my project fits. It's probably to the side, but I don't know if that's even helpful at all to your question.
Just to add, I guess, I mean, I'll confess I haven't read David Graeber's book on debt, but I think from what I understand, it's also tricky. We're talking about different conceptions of debt. In Graeber, a kind of anthropological theory of debt, which I know Marcel Mauss's work much more, and I think that's part of an influence on Levinas and obviously on Bataille, who I've worked on. So I kind of stress on the anthropological kind of community and particular kinds of relation of gift giving and excess, which comes back to parts of what Sarah was saying. The whole point of the gift giving is you don't give back straight away. That's rude. As in the UK, we have to have it, or used to before the coronavirus, of buying around. You buy your round, but then you wait until your round has circulated. You don't buy someone a drink straight away. And that's the kind of politics of gift giving, is always the kind of politics of delay and exchange, in contrast to a capitalist politics where you quit your debt. You pay at the counter and you're done, and you can take it away and do whatever you like. So there's a kind of anthropological critique of debt. And then obviously in people like Lazzarato, there's Nietzschean kind of discussion of debt through the genealogy of morals. And then there's the Marxist account of debt. So, I think there's kind of different competing frameworks in which to understand debt. As for politics of pause and dealing with it, I think I would be some of the accelerationist kind of arguments, and I think this can filter into discussions about debt, is if we just got rid of debt, everything would be fine. The way debt sort of stands in for capitalist relations or a bad thing. If we abandoned that kind of debt, we'd be fine. I think, unfortunately, capitalist social relations are a bit more kind of penetrative than just debt. Obviously, I'm generally in favor of, absolving people of debt. Debt is a major way of keeping people unpolitical. In the UK, it's particularly through the mortgage form. You have to have a mortgage to have a house. You have to have a job to pay your mortgage. If you protest, you lose your job. If you lose your job, you can't pay your mortgage, so you don't protest. So, you know, these are debt is a very successful way to kind of manage subjectivity in its capitalist form. But I don't think, you know, that debt is the only problem that we've got or confronting there. And I guess, you know, that's the kind of thing about politics of pause, is trying to kind of get some traction on debt and these other kind of political moments as particular kind of colonizations of time, because that's the other point people make about debt. Debt is a colonization of your future. Literally in a mortgage. I'm paying for my future.
If I could just follow up on that quickly, because bringing an author that hasn't been mentioned here, and this is the basis of my book on neoliberalism, which we're going to be talking about in the next seminar. But that's Maurizio Lazzarato, The Making of an Indebted Man, who basically makes a kind of accelerationist argument about debt, that it goes beyond economic debt, it goes into psychological debt, it gets in, you know, it's basically the foundation of the whole Christian idea of the infinite God to whom we are, you know, as finite human beings indebted, and therefore this is why we have to have, you know, a savior who comes, the so-called penal atonement theory that was developed in the Middle Ages and so forth. He sees this is all tied up with capitalism. He sees capitalism as something that arises out of the penal atonement theory in Christianity, which of course is entirely different than the Levinasian view of Judaism. But my question really is about, we talk a lot about democratic socialism, and the big issue in at least the American election, but it's also in Europe too. And I wanted to kind of get real, because that was the kind of context of this conversation, is that the issue is about debt and kind of, you know, infinite indebtedness, which is COVID is, you know, kind of inspiring, but it's also about debt to each other. You know, the whole notion of reparation is based on a theory of debt. Look what our ancestors did, you know, to so-and-so, therefore we're indebted, we need to, you know, do something about it and so forth. And I guess my question is very simple. Is the politics of pause kind of like a historical jubilee for both psychological and economic forms of debt? It's like, all right, let's just stop, you know, basically somebody like Lazzarato is implying, he doesn't really say it, that, you know, this is what's going to end capitalism, because capitalism is now in our very souls, it's in our very psyches. It's not just you know, simply about economic and productive relationships. You know, in a sense, our whole subjectivity is determined by it. And so does a politics of pause in a real sense maybe mean that we get over this kind of, you know, system of debt, which implies blame and also shame, in a sense, you know, does it come down to the issue of forgiveness?
Yeah, I mean, so Carl, in my approach, it's the opposite. In other words, in my version of a politics of pause, it's the opposite of a jubilee from guilt. And again, not in some kind of an overwrought, terrible version, but just in the sense, and that's why I use that example from Graeber, because again, this baseline communist sense. I'm not talking about you know, but yes, so I don't agree with Lazzarato on, I mean, that's right. I mean, so my version is, and again, this is where there's a Christian framing, right? So in a political theology's way of sort of seeing this as coming from a certain kind of theological structure, which has a lot of hegemonic elements to it. And then how is that going to do anything other than create problematic, you know, structures? But like you said, I mean, maybe it's just coming from a different perspective. In a Levinasian sense, that structure of debt is not coming from any theology. And I take it that when Graeber's talking about baseline communism, again, whether or not, you know, Robert had to hop off as well, but I mean, obviously you, Carl, or others who work on Marx, I don't know, you know, exactly if Graeber's way of talking about baseline communism as a basic interhuman debt is something that is or isn't how you would put it with respect to Marx. But in other words, that kind of debt, I I think is important for politics, and I don't think is hegemonic, and I don't think is coming from, I mean, I'm sure it is coming from Christianity in certain versions, but that's another piece as to why I said earlier, when I said as an aside, why I bring up terms like covenantality, because they're Jewish, and that's kind of a shocker in a contemporary context. The reason I say that is not just to be like, oh, you know, identity politics, no, but it's because it is, it's a critique, right? It sort of says not every time that you use the word covenant do you mean what traditions of Christians want to mean by Old Testament. Like, that's not the only thing it means, but also similar to words that are the same, like debt doesn't just mean something debilitating, it could mean something else. And similar, I mean, like, yeah, so in any case, yeah, my sense in my project is that there is a need for a certain kind of intrahuman debt and not for other kinds of intrahuman debt. But yes, those pieces to me make sense in a politics, in a good politics.
Thank you for both of you, for Carl and Sarah, kind of saying a little bit more about that. And I couldn't help but think of as well, you know, some of the stuff that Benjamin had said earlier, and some of the need to update our terms, because when you're using retread terms so often, it can become quite problematic. And from my own work and study with Sarah, sometimes Levinas's use of terms is, I don't want to say idiosyncratic, but there's a tension there, which leads to perhaps a large number of texts and interesting conversations around what is meant. Words like liturgy, endless patience, right? And I'm sure for those who are a little familiar, Levinas uses a pretty wide lexicon, and I appreciate Sarah's efforts as well as Benjamin's to sort of clarify, expand, and update that lexicon, which can create problems in our efforts. I want to move on to the next question from Ohad, who acknowledges arrived a little bit late, as did I. My apologies to all. But he had seen the use of the word catechon, and that was included in Professor Noyes' talk. He wanted to hear a little bit more about his approach to how the concept of inhibition would play out in this political ecological framework. And he asked specifically at the end of his question, would it be a kind of pharmacon a la Stiegler-Derrida? Professor Noyes.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things that's coming up again and again, understandably, is that Derrida point about paleonymic strategy, that you have to use the words you have. That's the way language works in terms of indebtedness. You know, this is Sassier's fundamental point, which I think is true, is you do not have a choice over the language in which you speak. More's the pity for me, because French would have been handy. You know, you are kind of existing within certain terms, and then the choice of those terms does have particular political, social, and philosophical kind of resonances and consequences. And I think, in a way, pretty much every philosophical or thinking strategy involves re-inscribing or reworking or dealing with particular terms. You know, Sarah listed quite a lot of you know, alliterative terms that she's working with, you know, and they're all, you know, that's the originality of the work is not, you know, I'm just inventing words off the top of my head. The originality emerges from the engagement, from her indebtedness, from the engagement with the terms that are then reworked. And I think this is something that, you know, I think Winnicott's true. And so I suppose this is what I was thinking about when I can read the questions there in the chat, you know, thinking about pharmacon in Stiegler and Derrida. I mean, there, I think for Stiegler especially, has a particular sense of technology and the kind of originary nature of the technological. That's Stiegler's kind of rejoinder, if you like, to Derrida and to phenomenology, is that there is an originary relationship to technology that we forget. You know, it's that kind of, everyone rewrites Heidegger. You know, what did we originally forget? It wasn't being, it was technology. You know, so his version is technology. So and then he does some interesting things with that. I think one of the interesting things Stiegler does is to try and rehabilitate critique after deconstruction, which I think is a kind of useful and interesting thing to do in his late work, and particularly the critique of political economy. he's tried. I don't think he always does it well, but I think it's good that he takes that on. In terms of catagon, yes, that's another reinscribed term. As I sort of mentioned in the talk, it comes from Carl Schmitt, who uses it for the state, and I'm trying to reinscribe it. I think it was Sarah reminded me, and I was thinking, like, why did I ever use that word? And you know, sometimes you have to kind of, I don't know, kind of go back to why you did use those words, and kind of hold yourself responsible for your own choices, in a sense. Maybe it comes back to Carl's point, guilt or debt. What little religious upbringing I had was Protestant, so I probably have some guilt issues. But I think you do have to kind of engage with your own kind of choice of the terms that you made, and then how they are supposed to be better. You know, in a sense, I think that's kind of maybe something underlying the whole kind of discussion we've been having. You know, I mean, in the sense that I originally coined accelerationism as a critical word, and then it got reappropriated. And we can all decry, you know, oh my God, you know, reappropriation of words. But I guess what the politics and the philosophy becomes like how then we collectively kind of cash out or debate or discuss or rework those concepts. So, you know, maybe then, what am I trying to say? You know, rather than, you know, there's an importance to precision. Derrida makes this point as well. You know, you can't just say all words are complicated and messy. You know, there's an importance to a precision in our language. But at the same time, you know, I think we have to accept the difficulty and the struggle that takes place through rewriting those particular terms. And like you say, Joshua, also considering their valence and how that might shift, even in relatively quick time, you know, from when I was talking about this now 10 years ago to now. So I think, yeah, that's what I was thinking about that question.
Thank you both. That was great, and a great question. And I didn't see another one there, but I had one. Oh, Sarah, sorry.
Just to jump in, I mean, I really like the way Ben is talking about that, right? I mean, that's sort of, there is no innocent words, right? I mean, so, and that the process of whatever we do is partially related to that indebtedness that words have, and I really like that. I'll just share as well that, you know, part of why I gravitated to that word in Ben's earlier work is because of an awareness on my part of, again, using covenantal as a kind of response to a kind of kairotic Pauline insistence in a Badiou and a Zizek, and in a very, you know, in a contemporary kind of political space. So yes, I definitely use that word in a kind of way, a bit polemic, but I like that catacon, the way that Ben is using it, opened up a Christian word in a way that I wanted to partner with. So I'm just sharing out loud that there are these other elements too of sort of, in my own work, there's definitely a polemic, and that I wear on my sleeve. So hopefully that's a better kind of polemic or whatever, but it's then the question about, it's not to say, oh, that Levinas is a Jewish project or something. That's not the point. It's about what are those words doing. So I particularly liked the opportunity to think together with another word that sounds like the starting words for covenant, kairos. And by the way, in my project, I also push back against Klinman. So I thought, oh, those are the bad words. So let me have another good word. So I'll take catacon in the non-Schmittian sense to sort of play on these sort of atheological uses of theological registers. I liked having a Jewish one and a Christian one. So just to share.
Thank you for that, Sarah. I guess in keeping with that, I kind of wanted to ask you both to share a little bit more about time or alternate temporalities, because you invested a bit of your discussions in that, specifically the construction of this discussion being pausal. I'm thinking, because of my own background, reading more phenomenology than accelerationist literature, but Husserl and Heidegger both, right? Time sort of frames or is the transcendental horizon, albeit in somewhat different respects. And Levinas is going to push against that. And Sarah, you constantly were talking about tiers, and Levinas is two-tier, but you want to really avoid the miscategorization of that two tiers. So you kind of leave it untouched a little bit. But this alternate temporality, I know that he defines messianicity in one of his essays on the God-man, I believe, as an apogee or a hesitation in being. the pause. And so I was wondering if both of you, and then of course the catacon precedes the messianic, as Professor Noyes pointed out. So I'm curious if either of you could speak about messianicity and its relation to political engagement or activity, in your specific ways of understanding that, right? Maybe atheological ways, but.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say quickly that the definite sense of the hesitation is the interruption, is the pause that I'm speaking of, and I'm speaking of it at the level of, again, of the phenomenological construction of a subject, but that has implications for a kind of precarity. That's really the implications of that temporality. Oh, I should add, a precarity that is related to interhuman debt. Not just a precarity. That's the problem with Klineman. It's not just a precarity. It's a precarity that has something to do with interhuman debt. So that's for me, and as Levinas says, even from his earliest works, that the temporality is brought on by the other. This is what to me is the sort of implication, is that what he's looking for is a kind of modality. Again, I'm doing it phenomenological, but even if you want to just say that's a fiction, but however it inflects to the political subject, because even Ben, you were saying that you obviously speak of a political subject without taking a stand on metaphysics of it. That's fine for me. And in fact, again, ultimately, I play more and more in the phenomenological register as a poetics, truthfully, that has implications for thinking about a political subject. So the question about an interruptive subject, a precarious subject, and a particular precarity related to interhuman justice, that's to me what the temporality in question is, the pausal temporality in question is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's coming clearer to me as well, like what Sarah was saying about kind of evental orientations, if we like, and then it's something that we're sharing is a kind of resistance to skepticism toward the kind of evental conception of history or politics. I never particularly like the Heidegger line, where the danger grows, there grows the saving also. What if there's just danger? Because it, as Sarah said, and I made this argument before, Heidegger is kind of an accelerationist. He's often seen as an anti-technological thinker, that's far from accelerationism as you could possibly be. He's the father of phenomenology, lived human time. But his whole argument about technology is that you have to traverse it. You have to it goes to the end. It's technological nihilism brought to its apogee is the completion of Western philosophy, the completion of all nihilism, and the kind of the opening to some non-technological relationship to being. So it's kind of interesting how various kind of seemingly oppositional positions actually start to merge into a more kind of common ground than you would think. And I think that's kind of one of the interesting sort of side effects or kind of considerations here. I'll come back to your point about time. I guess, I personally, I'm about to undermine my own point, but I guess I'm trying to avoid the simple model of like good time, bad time, which is so dominant. This is why I think quarantine effect. I get bored and post things on social media. The most important, one of which was recently the most important 20th century French philosopher is Bergson, the most influential, because I think Bergson's so influential, partly because of this contrast between lived time and abstract time. It's just everywhere, and it's very hard to avoid, and it has Marxist inflections in Lukács and Debord and people like that. So I think it's very hard to get away from a kind of contrasting good time, bad time. But I do also think it's a particularly unuseful way to think about things. I think I am trying to think, that's why I say about the bad new, or the catacon is the present that we're living out, that is like the end that won't end. Agamben calls it the time which remains. So the Messiah is not arriving. How are you living out this period of non-arrival of the Messianic? So maybe, that's what I'm trying to get at. I definitely haven't got an answer, a philosophy of it, or a phenomenology of it. But I think there is something there that maybe not just reaching for the good time, bad time move, might be something to think about. And within that, just about the Messianic, I think Catherine Malabou makes this point. It turns up in Spectres, Derrida's book. yeah, that was the part of Derrida that I liked least, and I was always most kind of suspicious of. You know, I think there is quite a contrast between the early Derrida in some ways and that kind of later emergence. In some ways, out of a very interesting and tangled dialogue with Levinas, as you both know much better than I do, you know, in terms of the early critique in writing and difference versus some of the later engagements. So there's a kind of, yeah, there's another whole kind of history of the messianic, I think, to be written.
And also quickly then on one of the pieces, I mean, again, with the differences between Levinas and Derrida, in the space of whatever the interhuman is, I mean, even Ben, in your project, I mean, you talk about, you know, you very nicely say it's sort of not as glamorous as space travel, but you call on sort of, you know, decommodification of people and the sort of return to support for public support systems and that kind of thing. I mean, frankly, that's the space of, and you also mentioned agency, obviously not in some kind of a, you know, whatever Cartesian sense or something, but that is actually, to my understanding, the space of Levinasian messianicity. So, I mean, in other words, it's what I call a micro messianicity or a micro revolutionarity. So in other words, to the extent that you have a project that's looking for a kind of, even though, again, I would say, we'll talk another time about what you meant by you don't want to return to the human. There's clearly,
sorry, I dodged that.
Yeah, but you clearly are looking for something about making the space better between people, and that for Levinas is the messianic. So
thank you. So I don't mean to interrupt.
No,
So I know we have to close out, and on November 17th, didn't want anybody to miss that. It's been put into the chat. You can look back. November 17th, same time as this one began, 10 a.m. Mountain Time. We'll be discussing Carl's text, which the title is what? Kant? I don't want to get it wrong here. Yeah, Neoliberalism and Political Theology. I just wanted to throw Kant in there. Sorry, Carl. I know we're going to have two respondents, Kieran Wirtz and Ward Blanton will be responding to Carl's text at that time. We'd love everybody to join us if you can. This was wonderful. Appreciate all the participation.
Thank you. That was awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm sorry, for technical reasons, we have to close this out right now. So anyway, hopefully we can come back to these topics and bring it up in future seminars, which are every month now. So thank you.
thank you. So good to meet you. I look forward to it.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.